Okay, thank you, Kate. For those of you who don't know me, and I know many people in the room do know me, and you came anyway, thank you. My name is Mike West. I am a member of the Oakland County Pioneer and Historical Society, and I want to thank the Lake Orion Historical Society and the Lake Orion Library for inviting us to come here today and speak. And in turn, you know, I hope that this serves as a platform where our two societies can get to know each other better and maybe work together, share ideas. And also, we do a monthly event called, we used to call it small talks, we now call them mini lectures. So if you have a historian who's knowledgeable on a particular subject, we invite you to come to our society, see me after the meeting, and we'll set you up for giving a mini lecture. So Kate says we want to hold this to an hour, so I'm going to try to move along as quickly as possible. I got a clicker in one hand, a pointer in the other hand. I'm wired to talk like I need it. All right, so I don't know. I'm being videoed. You know, I'm looking at the audience here, and we have some fantastic talent in this room. It makes me intimidated, you know. I mean, so much of this presentation was put together because of information who came from people like Dave Walls, like Barbara Fry. These people know so much about the history of Pontiac, their ability to pull information together. In fact, I see Christine Blackwell here. We have the Bloomfield Historical Society. She just wrote a book about the history of Bloomfield. So we've got the Bloomfield Historical Society. We've got Lake Orion Historical Society, Oakland County Pioneer and Historical Society. We almost have enough here for a historical convention, I guess. Barbara, did you wave your hand? Dave, where's Dave? Where's Dave sitting? See? Did you guys wave your hand? I like people. If you ever need research, Dave Decker, if you ever need research from Oakland County Pioneer and Historical Society, that's where the information is. Intrepid, they will get whatever it is you need. So we're going to talk about three things today. Kate asked me to talk a little bit about our society in case you don't know us. I want to talk about how the donation of a carriage led to me being here today. And a little bit about what the discovery about the forgotten piece of Pontiac history, which is the amazing carriage industry that it had. Oakland County Pioneer and Historical Society was founded by the pioneers in 1874. That makes us the oldest continuously operating county-based historical society in the state. Here's a picture of those fellas at the old agricultural fairground, which was a county fairground. The first meeting in 1874, these people had the foresight to recognize the need to record the history of this county. And our collection started with their personal donations. Fast forward from 1874, 1945, we acquire Pine Grove, which is the Moses Wisner estate. He was our 12th governor. Pine Grove is a gem in the city of Pontiac. It's located right on the old Saginaw Trail, which then became Saginaw Avenue, which then became Oakland, and then became Chavez. So we have a 4.5 acre campus. We have three historical gems there. The Moses Wisner House, which was built in 1845, an 1865 schoolhouse, and the Carriage House, which has been rebuilt and serves as our Pioneer Museum and also our headquarters. The Carriage House holds our research library. We have many of the early county records. It houses our archives and collections. And as an organization, we host about 20 events a year, which are intended to bring people to our campus. We We teach them history. We have events that are enjoyable, so they're fun to attend, and they're important to us because we use them as fundraisers, and that's how we stay alive. We don't get any money from any government entity. We raise money through our own wits. And so this is what our campus looks like and what it will look like in a couple of weeks when the flowers start to bloom. That is the Moses Wisner house. He's an interesting guy. He came from upstate New York, actually Western New York, much like the founders of Lake Orion, came from that same area. He was a lawyer, a successful lawyer. People who came to this part of the world from that part of the world had a particular religious fervor about them. If any of you have attended any of our mini lectures, you would have learned about the Second Great Awakening. Moses was an abolitionist. He was a believer in preservation of the Union. He had that strong work ethic that came from that area, and he was very active in the Republican Party. He was elected the second Republican governor of the state, pre-Civil War governor, and went on to muster 1,000 men to serve in the Civil War. He never saw any action. He actually died of camp disease, and his estate was very well taken care of by his wife. We, like I said, we acquired it in 1945, and let's take a look at some of the rooms in there. Oh, well, let's see, here's a panoramic pictures of the Moses Wisner house, our 1865 schoolhouse, the carriage house. Some snapshots of what the inside of the Moses Wisner house looks like. What you're looking at is the formal dining parlor, the furniture, the silverware, the pictures on the wall. Those are all original to the house. Moses operated, he had an office in town, but while he was governor, he operated out of the Wisner house. This is there was not a governor's mansion at the time, so he much of what he did was out of the Wisner house in Pontiac, and this is a Wooten desk, which was in great use by lawyers of the day. You could put all your documents inside the desk. You could lock it, and it had a mail slot. And for those lawyers who worked out of the courthouse, this was a very common thing used. In fact, President Grant had one. Queen Elizabeth had one. So wrong button again. This is the formal parlor, which he used for entertaining. He expanded the room when he was campaigning. What you're looking at, those are original paintings of the time, original wallpaper, original furniture, and original carpeting. Much of the house, I shouldn't say much, but a couple of rooms of the house are just as they were back when he was in the 1850s when he was running for office. Our one-room schoolhouse, the president of the One-Room Schoolhouse Society visited us a couple of years ago. She said we had the best collection of one-room schoolhouse desks that she has ever seen. We also have a couple hundred McGuffey readers, which was the reading tool of the day. And if you come to visit us and you pick up a reader and you look at it, you wonder why we still don't use it. We could give a talk just on one-room schoolhouses and how it influenced and formed the values of our nation through the 1800s. And also some of the names you see in there, oh yeah, there's a road with that guy's name. We'll move on to the carriage house. We have a farm museum in the carriage house, which pretty much has a representative display of all the tools and all the skills that were needed to make it in the pioneer society. The tools of carpenters, leather workers. We have an ice house display also, because that was a big industry in this part of the world once upon a time before electricity. you delve around through the records, our researchers are continuously discovering things that had been forgotten. Last year, I believe it was last year or maybe 2 years ago, Dr. Brieger found several documents that were land patents signed by President Jackson, President Monroe, President Adams. And these are great discoveries, right? If you are nice to our researchers and you scroll around downstairs, you can also find the document that was signed by Abraham Lincoln appointing Thomas Jefferson Drake, who was the first president of our society, to be a magistrate in the Utah Territory. A few years ago, Guy Duffield, who's one of our researchers, came across a telegram that Lindbergh had sent. He found it in our records. He attributed his successful flight across the Atlantic to a freeze plug that was designed and made by a company here in Oxford. And he called them up. They had forgotten all about it. They 2 or 3 generations later. So it was quite an interesting event when we presented them with the information. We partner with many different organizations. 2 that we partner with are Oakland University and Waterford Schools. We recently excavated our ice house. And it's kind of interesting. I'm 74 years old, and these kids are, wow, look at this. And looked like a tuna fish can that my grandmother threw out. I recognize that. It's got a little key that you roll it back. So we pretty much talked about everything on this slide. I like this slide because that's my granddaughter, and I think everybody should be aware of her. A couple of years ago, we get a phone call from a farmer way up in Wisconsin, and he says he has a 1901 standard vehicle carriage. Can you hear me okay? Ah. I could sit in your lap. So he tells us he has a carriage built in Pontiac in 1901, a standard vehicle carriage. And would we be interested in it? Well, you bet. So we negotiate an agreement, and another volunteer and I drive up to pick up the carriage, and we roll it out of the barn and look at it. Now, oops. Here we go, this one. The top is raggedy. A lot of the cloth materials are deteriorated. Some of the leather is gone, the fender leather and the fenders are gone. But the integrity of the vehicle is there. The wheels, the axles, the body, it's all good. So we have kind of a gem, we feel. Don, you know it very well. You helped push it in and out of the trailer a couple times.
There's no motor on it.
You is the horsepower. Yeah. Randy Hammonds and his mom donated it to the museum, and really good people. We get it back, and I look on the rear axle, and there is its birth certificate. It was made by the Standard Vehicle Company in Pontiac, Michigan, for the Lindsay brothers in Minneapolis. The Lindsay brothers, Nancy, thank you for this information, were a distributor of farm implements, and they also sold carriages. I believe that Standard Vehicle cut a deal and maybe even gave this guy the carriage in order to promote it locally. And indeed, Standard Vehicle was sold across the United States. Well, what do you know? This is the place the vehicle was born. And it's still with us today. It's one of the 2 remaining carriage factories that are still with us today in Pontiac. And this is what the story is about. Indeed, Pontiac was the home of a forgotten carriage industry that led to the formation of GM Truck and Pontiac division of GM. Paul and Elise bought the standard vehicle building, and they are much of my motivation in putting this information together, because they, by themselves, are restoring and preserving that building. I mean, it's moving. So what makes Pontiac a chosen place to be the center of a carriage industry? Well, let's go back a little bit in time. Here's a 1819 Philadelphia newspaper. This is way before we became a state, or Pontiac became a city. Matter of fact, Pontiac was only settled in 1818. And it describes, it extols the virtues of the area. It extols the pristine waters, good for fishing, good for water power. It extols the fertile land, much like upstate New York, right? So people start to come west. Here's an excerpt I took out of 1874 newspaper. When our society had their first meetings, almost every word that was said was recorded and published. And I was looking through, this was a few years ago, before we even got the carriage, a recollection of one of the pioneers who said, back in the day, in the early 1800s, or somewhere between 1830 and 1850, 50 to 150 carts and wagons a day came through town. Now, I mean, that's a lot. How could that be? Was it local farmers coming to pick up goods or deliver goods? Or was it people who were headed north to claim their tract of land that they bought from the government for $1 to $2 an acre? Clearly, there's a need for carts and wagons in the Pontiac area. So we take a look at what some of the early industry was. Clearly farming. There were also grist mills and sawmills. And if you have an interest in the grist mills and sawmills of Pontiac, there's a guy in the back of the room who's our expert, and he will be giving a talk later on in the year about the grist mills of Pontiac and flour mills of Pontiac. We also had a huge knitting mill industry because Oakland County at one time was a leading producer of wool goods in the state. And we had the required blacksmith shops. Here's an 1867 map, of Pontiac, once again, wrong finger. 1867 map of Pontiac. This would be the Saginaw Trail. You're looking west, so here is east. This would be what is now M59, Huron Street, headed west. There's some interesting things that this map shows us. One is, you look here and you see a train trail. You see a train headed north and you see a train headed south. So Pontiac was connected to the north and to Detroit, hence to the river. So it was, because we had the trains, we were part of a shipping network, and we were also connected to the east-west train tracks. Another thing that I think is interesting is this was the early fairgrounds that were in Pontiac. And the reason we're mentioning this is because when you have the local county fair, and later on we had this fairground closed up and another one was built out this way. I learned this from Barbara. We also held a state fair a couple years. When you hold these events in Pontiac, guess who places first in carriage building and in horseshoeing? Our Pontiac guys. So this was good publicity. What we're going to talk about today is where the industry started, I believe, here in the central section of Pontiac. We're going to go up north to this intersection here, which is where Pontiac started, Pontiac Division of General Motors. We're going to look a little bit to the west, where there was some more carriage manufacturing, and then we're going to go head south, which is where GM Truck and Bus started. and we're going to talk about the standard vehicle building on Osman Street and a couple other places. So again, why Pontiac? We had the water power. We had availability of coal to produce steam, plenty of wood for making wood-bodied vehicles. We had a nascent infrastructure. We also had money. The Pontiac merchants fed the lumber camps up north. And so the merchants prospered on this, and that made funding available to develop the industry. We had the Saginaw Trail. We had railroads. In fact, we had 3 railroads around the turn of the century. And we had 1 or 2 electric interurbans. The value of that was the interurbans brought labor from Detroit into town. We mentioned the county fairs. It was a county seat also, so there was a lot of lawyers and judges that lived in the Pontiac area. These are all things that come to play in choosing Pontiac as a site for carriage manufacturing. This chart is intended solely to show the fantastic growth that took place in Michigan. It goes from 1820 to 1920, and it shows the continuing population explosion in the state. What is of particular interest is back in 1820, there were 7,400 people in the state of Michigan, and maybe 18 in Pontiac. All of a sudden, it jumps to 28,000 in 1830. And then another 7-fold increase in population from 1830 to 1840. Can any of the historians here explain that? Oh, Sue. Yeah, you got it. You got it. The Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was only open for about 5 years, from 1820 to 1830. But then it went into full swing, and that's when the population really started to move people into town. So you can see there was a continual growth in Pontiac population also. We're going to focus on this section here, which was the heyday of the carriage industry. It was short-lived, and its demise was even shorter. What I do want to point out is there was a blip in our population growth right about here. And that was due to an economic downturn in Pontiac, which was pretty much relegated to Pontiac itself, not the rest of the state. What that meant is men who needed to continue work left Pontiac, and where did they go? They went to Flint. 2 guys from Pontiac went and started the carriage business in Flint. And I mention this to you because Flint is the home of William Durant. He made zillions of dollars on the carriage and cart industry, and he founded General Motors, and then he came to town and bought up much of Pontiac. So I think it's important to mention that some of our talent started Flint. Pontiac and Flint were continuously vying for competition. I think by the time this presentation is over, I will learn my right-hand clicker from my left-hand light. All right. A forgotten industry. Let's step back a bit and look at the nation as a whole. Because the nation needed carts and wagons and carriages. Almost every center of population had some type of carriage manufacturing industry. The premier is Amesbury, which is in a suburb of Boston. That was the premier. As a matter of fact, over the century, Amesbury even had an assembly line for building carriages. But that was where the premier vehicles were made. The most patents in the nation were there. However, before the Civil War, key materials to build a carriage had to be imported. The steel came from England. The leaf springs came from England. That means you had to wait longer. That means you had to pay more. And carriages were really relegated to the rich. And those carriages and those carts and wagons that were made here were primarily handcrafted. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. Then comes the Civil War. There's a huge demand for armament. There's a huge demand for the industry that's required to support the war effort. We needed steel mills. We needed iron. We needed copper. We needed the factories to make finished products. Detroit was a part of that, by the way. So now we can make our own steel. So that brings the cost down. Imagine you're in a blacksmith shop. We've all seen blacksmiths work. He's got an iron bar. He puts it in a forge. He heats it up. He takes it out. He hammers it to shape. He didn't heat it enough. He's got to put it back in. He takes it back out. He hammers it some more. He makes a finished fitting for a carriage. There's a lot of metal fittings on a carriage. There's a lot of metal on a carriage. And most of it was either handcrafted or it was made with, help me out here, Paul, pouring metal into a mold, casting, metal casting. But that too had to be hand finished. So now we have mechanization. The Industrial Revolution is taking place. You can buy a machine that hammers that fitting to place. So what does that do? Cost comes down. What does that do? All the fittings are the same. They all fit together. Your quality improves. Another factor that takes place. When the carriages were handcrafted, there was a family of support infrastructure. There was a lumber mill, there was a planing mill, there was another shop that cut the wood to shape, there was another shop that warped the wood and enabled you to build a carriage. There was a whole family, a whole infrastructure, a series of blacksmith shops making the hub, the wheel rim, all these different metal devices that were in a carriage. Now you can buy machinery and dramatically reduce the cost of time required. You kept everything in-house, you improved your time, you had less material in stock, your costs went down, and that was transferred to the public. The wheel spoke I have up in here is a primary example. When you had to cut everything to shape by hand, they were all different. So if you broke a spoke, you had to refabricate it. Whereas now, you can get a replacement item off the shelf. So this greatly improves quality, greatly drops cost, and the Philadelphia Exposition of the 1876, I think, triggered the American industry, which is about the time the carriage industry in Pontiac started to take off. Carriages and carts, American built, were featured in that trade show. As the population moved west, the industrial centers also moved. St. Louis, Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati was huge in the carriage industry. Chicago was huge, but then they had the fire, and that put them out of business for a while. And Michigan. You could buy a carriage now for under $100. And the quality was better than anything that was seen before. Here's an idea of what an early carriage shop may have looked like, something that you might find on West Lawrence Street in Pontiac. You see it's very crowded. It was heated with a cast iron stove, not many windows, so you were restricted to daylight hours, kerosene lighting. This shop was retrofitted with, I think this is a planing device, belt driven, so there was an outside power source, probably steam. But you can see it's nowhere capable of mass production. It's going to take a long time to make a carriage. Here is a carriage of artistic beauty, great styling, great craftsmanship, great luxury, but it's not us. We don't use those. This was made in Paris, and it's for the royalty exclusive market of Europe. This is us. This is what we needed. We're Americans. We had thousands and thousands and thousands of independent businessmen in the United States called farmers. And profit and loss was big to them. They needed a functional vehicle to get their goods to market during harvest time, and they needed feed to feed their stock. This is what they needed, and that's all they could afford. Merchants needed the same kind of vehicle. They had to go to the dock, they had to go to the depot to pick up goods, take it to their shop. On Sunday, come Sunday go to meeting, the farmer would sweep out the back of the cart. The kids would go in the back. Mom and Dad would sit up on the seat on top, and they would go to church. And the kids would complain because they're bouncing around in the back. And Dad might say something like, well, you're lucky I had grain because next week I'm going to have manure. So, and you can see there's very poor suspension in here. It was a rough ride. We needed conveyances to get us from town to town. We needed functional vehicles. And these kind of vehicles were made in Pontiac. Here's a mail truck. Here's an interesting, this is a wagon fitted with a tank, and this went from Pontiac to Lake Orion and delivered oil, delivered kerosene, and delivered axle grease. So from 1904 to 1911, this is how Lake Orion got its lubricants and fuel. Something that you might find in an inner city, an interesting vehicle here. This is a two-wheel cabriolet. So if you were a businessman visiting Detroit or New York City, and you come down from your hotel room and you see the doorman, you would ask him to call for you a cabriolet. I mention this because it's a term that's still with us today. Hose carts. Dave, who is this guy? Where's Dave?
Merrill Wall. He lived in Dayton.
This is a picture donated by Dave. This is another small market for small people. This is a very important slide to me. This actually was a vehicle sold as is. It's called a skeleton. There's not much to it, and I would imagine you can go pretty fast through town. But what's important is this shows you how a carriage is made. This is called a chassis. It consists of a frame, a rear axle, a front axle, and four wheels. All carriages consisted of two components, a chassis and a wooden body that was placed on top of it. This is the same way automobiles were made for decades, of a chassis and a body, until the unibody came around 20 or so years ago. Here's a picture of a carriage that shows that type of construction. Now here's a nice looking, beautiful vehicle. You see a very rich color combination of black and green. You see gold detailing on it, plush seats, leaf suspension in the back and in the front. Beautiful vehicle. Wouldn't you rather take your children to church on Sunday in this rather than the old farm wagon? And as a matter of fact, if you were the first person in town to have this vehicle, I would imagine that the Standard Vehicle Company in Pontiac would be getting a few more orders once your fellow churchgoers saw you driving this into town. It would be nice if it could be affordable, and it was. Carriages were sold under $100, and you'll soon find out you could buy a carriage from Pontiac for under $50. A couple things I want to convey to you. This part of the carriage is called a dashboard. When the horse would dash, the horse would kick up clods of dirt, and this protected the occupants from getting hit. The term is still with us today. Every car has a dashboard. The body was made of wood. Here the floor is covered with a carpet, but because the body was made of wood and the floor was made of boards, the the floor is called floorboard. I was at my Chrysler dealer a couple months ago, and he was talking about the floorboard. Here's another esoteric term that Paul might know. This is a coach lamp, probably lighted by kerosene. It has a door in the front that you could open because kerosene is smoky. So you could go inside and you could clean the lamp. And that was called a lamp door. I was in the automotive lighting business till about 15 years ago. And that terminology was still used. I don't know if you ever heard it at Ford, Paul. Headlamp door. The headlamps don't have doors today, but that part of the headlamp assembly was called the headlamp door. In the winter, when they weren't making carriages, they were making sleighs. Here's downtown Pontiac in the late 1880s. The streets are lined with carriages and wagons. And it's a mud street. This is Saginaw Street. Downtown Birmingham, exactly the same. In fact, our streets in the late 1800s and early 1900s were dirt for the most part. And this is what you got into during the wet season. It was very difficult traveling during the wet season. And one thing I like about this picture, it shows a tremendous torque and load that's put on the carriage, being stressed and twisted like that. So even though your carriage weighed 50 pounds and cost under $100, it had to be sturdy. Typical of what was encountered. Now we talk about how difficult it was to getting around. But when the roads hardened, when the roads were dry, men had their fun. You can see racing your carriage through town was a problem everywhere. And towns had to enforce speed limits and policemen. It turns out this policeman that gave President Grant a ticket also had multiple offenses himself, because men liked to compete. They liked, in the 1800s, men loved their horses and their carriages. And in the 1900s, on Woodward Avenue, from 1950 through 1970, they loved their horsepower. So this helped drive the market. After 1872, when Pontiac gets serious about the carriage industry, Michigan becomes the fourth leading producer of carriages in the country. There's a lot of people involved with the carriage industry. I'd like to talk about 6 of them here, because these were the key players, I believe, from the research that we've been able to produce. And there was 4 locations, 4 pockets of the carriage industry in the city of Pontiac. And we'll dwell a little bit on each one. All right, so we're going to talk about the downtown area around Lawrence Street. We're going to go up to the intersection of what was Saginaw, what was Oakland, and Baldwin. We're going to go a little bit west to talk about the Beaudette factory, and then we're going to go south, which is where Osman Street is and where General Motors truck started. 1872 map showing downtown Pontiac. This would be Pike Street going east and west. This is Saginaw going north and south. Here's what we know as M59 today, Huron Street. I believe that pretty much the carriage industry started in this area right here. Actually, between these 2 twists in the river. We'll skip this one. We're going to talk about R.D. Scott because he was a key player. He came to Pontiac about 1865. He came from Canada. He apprenticed under one of the carriage manufacturers, and then he opened up his own business on Lawrence Street, on West Lawrence Street in 1888, making carriages and wagons. He was a good businessman. He made a quality product. His business grew, and then he moved and opened another facility around where the depot is today, where the train station is today, and he built an enormous factory making primarily wagons. At some point, he was making 5,000 wagons of buggies a year and 500 sleighs. His building burned down in 1906. And R.D. Scott was a little older and didn't want to get started again, and he soon disappeared from the scene. Here's the first large building he built down by the depot. Multi-storied, huge structure, right next to the railroad. Great idea. You can unload and unload goods into your shop. He expanded from that one building. Now he's got 3 giant buildings, and he hits a fire which burns everything down, almost burns down the town of Pontiac. Now when you look at fires, by the way, were not uncommon to the carriage industry. We had 5 major fires within maybe 5 or 6 years. What happens here, what you're looking at is wooden buildings. You're looking at wooden buildings that are surrounded by acres of wood to build carriages. You're looking at wooden buildings that are filled with sawdust, wood shavings, filled with combustibles. You're looking at they painted vehicles in here. They're full of varnish and paint. So now you have combustibles and volatiles. And how were these buildings lighted? How were they heated? The newer ones had steam heat. The newer ones had electric generation to have electric lighting. But the older ones had kerosene lamps, had gas lighting. So now we have combustibles, volatiles, and an ignition source. And the method of fire control was primitive. There was a fire station down the street, but when something like this goes up, what they had on site were barrels or pails of salt water. You just can't control it. Martin Halfpenny. Kind of a character. He's kind of difficult to follow. He was significant in the business. He came just a few years after R.D. Scott. Martin Halfpenny, he and his brother were blacksmiths. He was a carriage maker. He got his son into the business. It was kind of difficult to trace him. I used the Pontiac City Directory throughout to validate information I would find. And it was always hard to trace Martin Halfpenny because I don't think he always registered with the city directory. But every few years, he changed partners. He went into a different business. And about 1906, there was a news blurb that he was a car designer working for the new Pontiac Motor Company. Then he kind of falls off the map. But he held about 5 patents that were critical to the carriage industry. And at one time, he was building what was called a spring platform wagon, which was the wagon to have. This is, I believe, his brother's shop, right, Barbara?
They had it together, but that is his brother James and
Then he went on, then they split and went different ways. This is probably on West Lawrence Street, right next to the river. Here's a flyer that when they were partners, they produced. It's kind of interesting. Facts, facts, facts. You hear there's other quality carriage manufacturers, but Halfpenny is the best. Martin ran his carriage department, his brother ran horseshoeing, and his brother was first in the county fair and first in the state fair. And if you read this, it's quotes from Shakespeare saying, you cannot dream of the beauty that you will receive, referring to his horseshoes. Here's the vehicle he made. Notice the axle, that bent axle. I believe that aided in getting over stumps and rocks in the roadway. We talked about racing vehicles through town. If you were really serious, you'd have your two-wheel sulky made by Martin Halfpenny. Here's a publication in one of the journals, The Horseless Age, Pontiac Motor Car Company. Martin Halfpenny is a designer. There was another carriage business in town called Union Buggy, and I have this in here for one reason. You can buy a buggy for $50, less than $50. If you don't like it, you can bring it back in 30 days and we'll give you your money back. This carriage was $65, but it had rubber tires. Now we're going to go up north. By the way, I know there's a lot of people in the room, like Mark Thomas, who are extremely knowledgeable about this market. Please, at any time, if you want to make a correction or adjust me, feel free to do so before I get into trouble. So now we go up Oakland Avenue, and by the way, Oakland County Pioneer is right there. But we go up to this intersection of Oakland Avenue and Baldwin. This is now known as Chavez Avenue. There was a company here called Pontiac Phaeton. It didn't last very long. And what we're going to talk about is the events that happened right here. C.V. Taylor was lured to Pontiac by the citizens of Pontiac. They bought the land and they bought his building. He came to town with grand ideas about how to build carriages using new technology. And so Pontiac wanted to expand their carriage business because they didn't want to rely just on the knitting mills. So C.V. Taylor starts out. A young man comes to Pontiac who was in the hardware business, I believe. His name is E.M. Murphy. And he partners with C.V. Taylor for a few years, learning the business, learning the market. And during those few years, Dunlap Vehicle comes on the scene. Crescent comes on the scene. Michigan Box and Body comes on the scene. And E.M. Murphy decides he wants to get into business on his own. And he negotiates with these folks, and pretty soon he takes over those businesses. And he's got this whole area here, and he builds this huge Pontiac buggy company. And it's a quality buggy. And we talked about this. Here's from a couple of advertising brochures what the Pontiac Phaeton company looked like. And here is the Pontiac Buggy Company building. This would be Chavez Avenue right here. And there used to be a railroad that came through here. C.V. Taylor was over here, and Crescent and Dunlap. Huge building. I mentioned earlier Amesbury, Massachusetts had the premier vehicle. Well, Murphy played off that name and he built the Western Amesbury. Here's his advertising brochure. I'll show you a picture of what the building really looks like. It didn't quite look like that, but that was common in the carriage business. His brochure, his vehicle. So about 15 years ago, we get a letter from a guy in Washington State. And he said, you know, my family bought a Pontiac buggy vehicle over 100 years ago, and we still ride it. Here's a picture of it. Here's a Pontiac buggy vehicle on display at the Pontiac Museum in Pontiac, Illinois. And you look at this vehicle, and it's quite sturdily built. It's got iron axles, it's got rubber wheels, and this is pre-1900. Same building, different name. Murphy decides he doesn't want to make wagons anymore. He thinks gasoline-powered vehicles are the way to go, and he converts his plant to making the Oakland Motor Car Company. View from above. General Motors, Durant takes over Pontiac Buggy Company around 1909, I think. Again, here's Chavez or Oakland Avenue. This is where the railroad track used to be. Here's the Pontiac Buggy Company. And you see C.V. Taylor's gone, Crescent, Dunlap, they're all gone. And General Motors is building this huge complex to build the new Oakland. This would be the headquarters. By the way, this is all gone, and the railroad is gone, but this is still with us today. This is still there. In fact, here's a view from above. Oakland Avenue, Chavez Avenue, the old railroad track. This building is still with us, and this building is still with us. And this is the Pontiac headquarters building. This is what it looked like in the early 1920s. This is what it looks like today. Now we'll head west. several different businesses there. The one I want to talk about is the Beaudette factory. There were a couple carriage businesses here before O.J. Beaudette bought that site. He operated a beautiful carriage and wagon manufacturing business, and then he decided to focus on just making carriage bodies. And that was his business. He sold carriage bodies to carriage manufacturers. He may have been the first to make a metal carriage body. I'm not sure about that. He suffered 2 disastrous fires. The first one burned his building to the ground. He rebounded. Almost every one of these guys, besides Scott, rebounded. Then went on to, he got a contract from a car company in Jackson, Michigan, I think, and he began supplying them with bodies. Then along comes Henry Ford, and he becomes a body supplier to Henry Ford for the Model T. You could make the body, load it on the tracks, send it down the train track to Highland Park to his brand new Model T plant. Business was great, but so was business over at Oakland. And Fisher Brothers, Fisher Body was the body manufacturer to General Motors. They buy O.J. Beaudette, make bodies there for a year, tear the building down, and it's now a park in Pontiac. O.J. Beaudette was an interesting guy. He was a benefactor, like Martin Halfpenny, to the St. Vincent de Paul Church. But this is a little known fact. He was the man behind paving Woodward Avenue all the way from Square Lake Road up to about where the Masonic Lodge is now. This is the factory that he bought, the one that burned to the ground. You can see there's a small railroad siding here. You see acres of wood surrounding it. We talk about combustibles. This was his new factory that he used to build bodies for the Model T. Here's a footprint of that building off of one of our maps, which Fisher Body took over and tore down. Bad pictures of the fire, but it was a disastrous fire. And here's a newspaper article from 1908. Business is good. Pontiac Wheel Company's doing great business. That was just down the street from O.J. Beaudette. O.J. Beaudette and Monroe Body Company are supplying bodies to Henry Ford for the Model T. And Monroe was right next door to your building. And we're going to skip these because we're running out of time. I'm going to go down here to Area 4. So here's downtown Pontiac. Here's Osman Street. And I want to talk about this business right here. Pontiac Spring and Wagon Works, owned by A.G. North. He used to be in Pontiac. And his building burned down in 1899. In 1899, he builds a new, bigger, larger building, all brick. It's not going to burn down. At least the outside walls won't burn down. And he's making vehicle springs and vehicle axles. And he also is making, here's a picture of his building. The sign is still on it. Pontiac Spring and Wagon Works. Here's what it looks like from Woodward. Here's a reproduction, thank you, Dave, of a Pontiac Spring and Wagon vehicle. He goes on to make a vehicle called a Highwheeler. And I think it merges with Carter Car to make those vehicles in that building. But I can't recite exactly the chain of events, but while he is president of, according to the Pontiac City Directory, of Pontiac Spring and Wagon Works, he becomes president of Rapid Motor Vehicle Company, which was the predecessor of GM Truck. Don, if you see anything you want to correct, feel free. Pontiac Spring and Wagon goes into Oakland Motor Car Company, and that all becomes part of General Motors. They stop making the Carter car after a while, and then they go to make the Friend. And I think there was another car or two that may have been made there afterwards, I'm not sure.
There was Carter car, Olympian, and Friend.
All three of them were made there. Thank you. That appears in one of the later. Mark is a connoisseur of Pontiac automotive history. So here's that 1901 map again. Shows Osman Street in 1901. There was a Baumgartner Body Works, and this, I think, was called a knitting mill. This is a treasure of automotive history on Osman Street. There were so many businesses that started up there supporting the carriage trade, supporting the automotive business. And I feature those in red. Here's a series of some of the owners of the Standard Vehicle Company. 1896 map, it just shows a sawmill on Osman Street. But we got a nice railroad here with a siding, and we got a turntable, and we got an engine house there. You don't see anything going on over here in 1896. 1903, we have Hodges Vehicle Company. We have Standard Vehicle Company, and we have Pontiac Turning Company. I believe these are the guys that cut the wood for the bodies. 1907, the street is really filling in. Pontiac Spring and Wagon, you see now is multiple buildings. You see the beginning of Rapid Motor Vehicle here. And here we go, Mark, Olympian Motors now is on this site in 1919. And Oakland Motor Car Company eventually, I think, takes over your building, right? So we try to trace the history of the Standard Vehicle Company. This is one of the two remaining buildings in Pontiac. It was built in 1901. Remember, Pontiac Spring and Wagon, 1899. It's kind of interesting. It was formed by investors and a few people from the carriage industry. It was a beautifully built building. Brick exterior. Again, it's not going to burn down, at least the outside. They generated their own power to run the machines. They generated their own heat to heat the building, so we didn't need gas, we didn't need kerosene. Two of the men that were heavy investors in the business were also county execs. A couple were bankers, and a couple of them owned Monroe Body next door. They claimed they could make 5,000 to 7,000 vehicles a year. They started business 1901. They were covering the country with vehicles. In 1907, they go into receivership. So what happened? Here is another rendering of a business according to the wagon manufacturer that chooses to put a drawing of his building on the cover. Standard Vehicle, our plant. So it's kind of interesting. You got the railroad right here. You got a nice building here to load your product onto railroad cars. Here's Saginaw or Woodward Avenue, and you see the electric line going up and down. Goes all the way into Detroit, and it brings labor to Pontiac. 30-minute ride, you can go to work. 30-minute ride, you can go home. Now it says our plant, but indeed this is the Hodges plant, and it was owned by Mr. Hodges, who is a character, by the way, in Pontiac history himself. He claims that his great-grandfather was the first man to take a horse-drawn wagon from Pontiac to Detroit, and he claims to be the first man to drive a motor car in the city of Pontiac. He drove it up from Metzger on Jefferson. So this is Hodges. It also is where Welch, he doesn't last very long in the carriage business either, and pretty soon Welch Motor Car is made in this building. But this is the Standard Vehicle Company. So although it says our plant, it's not exactly true. Another thing that's different is the building sits on a hill. It's not all on level ground like that, but that's being picky. Some verbiage from their catalog, very bad picture from their catalog. But now we start going into the history of the company. 1901, a trade journal says Standard Vehicle Company is started. It's got great people running it. You got people from Dunlap, the buyers, Nichols from Dunlap, who was a buyer from Dunlap when he was 13 years old. You've got a guy from the bank that loaned from Oakland County Savings on Saginaw Street that loaned them money. And what it says here that's kind of interesting, Paul and Elise, says that it's a 75 by 130 foot building. I believe that was 50,000 square feet approximately, right? It gets bigger. Because that building in the picture wasn't, it's twice as big as your building. So they have this great team, but then the next year, another journal reports that Mr. Cudner, who was the president, decides to go back into the newspaper business. That's where he came from. He's no longer going to be the president of Standard Vehicle. And he wants to get back into the business, but he doesn't get back into the newspaper business. He goes on to be the president, I believe, of Monroe, which is next door. 1903 Free Press article. Standard Vehicle Company is the place to be. They do 7,000 vehicles a year. They employ 100 men. They pay a total of $52,000 a year in salary. So if you divide 100 into $52,000 and divide that by 5 days a week, a man is paid $2 a day to build a carriage. And that was the going rate in Pontiac at the time. It goes on to say that they generate all their own power and they have a good team. The stockholders made two major investments in the company. So now, I believe, according to this, I don't have a date on this article, but now the building is 100,000 square feet. So it doubles in size, and that would explain the building that used to be attached to yours. 1907 comes around, and there's an industry shockwave. Business can't ship product, there isn't enough railroad cars. And Standard Vehicle Company cites that as a problem. They're hitting additional expense. They're renting space all over town to store their vehicles. But I think there was another problem, because about 1907, the motor car started to come to be. So this is cited as a problem. That's 1907. Later in 1907, in one of the journals, it's published that the Standard Vehicle Company goes into receivership. They can't pay their bills. And Mr. C.V. Taylor, who we talked about, who the town bought free land and a free factory for, and was a partner with E.M. Murphy, he is the receiver. He's taken over the business, he knows the business, and he thinks he can bring it back to life. Here's another article from 1907. Two of the executives go to the court and plead for protection because the books were doctored by the 13-year-old whiz from Dunlap, Mr. Nichols. So the creditors are coming after the company, and they're going to come after the directors, but don't come after us because we had nothing to do with it. I cut this out of a 1907, June 27th, Belding Banner newspaper. It's written kind of like the Martin Halfpenny flyer. The Standard Vehicle Company is embarrassed to say they need to raise money for cash. They can't pay their bills, so they're auctioning off a carload of Standard Vehicle buggies in Belding. 1908, C. Taylor puts the building up for sale. 1909, a lawsuit is filed against the Standard Vehicle Company by this man. He says he was hired by the Standard Vehicle Company to design an automobile. So clearly the leaders of the company recognize the need to get out of the carriage business and get into the motor car business much as E.M. Murphy did several years ago. But the judge says the laws of Michigan protect labor. They don't protect you because you're brain power. In 1909, the Auto Top and Trimming Company buys Standard Vehicle building. Later on, it's sold to Monroe, and later on, it's sold to Oakland Motor Car Company. You know, we'll skip this. This is what the building looks like from the street now. This is what it looked like in a postcard somewhere around 1903. Pontiac, Michigan, a view of the factory district. Here's the railroad. Osman Street is on the other side of these buildings. Here's Hodges. And here is the expanded, the original building, and then the expanded building. Doesn't quite look like it did in the brochure, either does this. In fact, it looks kind of shabby in the postcard, but man, there's 100 jobs there. There was jobs all the way up and down the street. So this may be more real what the building looked like back then. I mentioned earlier that two men left Flint, left Pontiac, Patterson and Stewart. They went and started a carriage company and a carriage body company in Flint. They got Flint going in the business. But there's this guy named William Durant in town, and he partners with Mr. Dort, and the two of them buy up every business in Flint. They buy up all the suppliers, they buy up all the carriage and cart companies, and they own the town. They claim that they make more vehicles in Flint than Pontiac does. In fact, there was a time when the State Fair was in Pontiac that the Pontiac Fire Department would race against the Flint Fire Department. They had fire truck races, and I don't know who won, but that's what the nature of the rivalry was. So now Durant is a multi-zillionaire, and he decides he's going to go around the state. In fact, he went around the country buying up businesses. And he comes to Pontiac. He buys Oakland Motor Car Company. He buys Rapid. He buys Pontiac Spring and Wagon Works. Am I right there? Don?
I can't connect that.
It's hard tracing all. In fact, it's hard remembering all this. Here's a chart that kind of summarizes what happened. This is the vehicle carriage manufacturers, carriage suppliers, when I could find the amount of investment from the Pontiac City Directory, I documented in 1895, 10 vehicle manufacturers, 13 suppliers. But they were nowhere near of the size and caliber of what was happening in 1902 or 1904. In 1904, at the peak, we had maybe a dozen different carriage manufacturers and at least a dozen to 16 suppliers. There was $1 million invested in concrete and equipment in 1907. But this is about the time that the motor-driven vehicle guys come on the scene. There was 2 in Pontiac in 1907, 5 in 1915. Just about everybody in the carriage business is gone. In fact, one of the fence manufacturers took over some of the carriage business, and you could buy parts from him, from the guy that previously made fences and still did make fences in Pontiac. Huge investment in the ground. At one point, Pontiac claimed they made 100,000 vehicles a year. I believe that might be somewhat apocryphal. It probably is twice as many as they made. But 70 to 90% of the workforce was employed making carriages. 1907, that was the peak year. Then Welch and Rapid came on the scene. Carr later on, and that was the beginning of the end. The automobile was actually cheaper to operate than a horse and more reliable. You could run it at full speed in the summer or in the winter, and you couldn't do that with a horse. It was less polluting. You didn't have to clean up after it. At least it was less polluting in their eyes back then. And this says it all. In 1901, we produced 3,200 vehicles. In 1915, 807,000 in 14 years. What exponential growth. And most of that was Henry Ford. And of course, we had O.J. Beaudette and Monroe Body sending bodies down. Now, Henry had 10 different suppliers, so they didn't make all the bodies, but they made their share. The end of the business for horses, and now you could buy your Welch or your shiny new Oakland. Well, these trucks weren't so shiny, but they did the job. Thank you. I'm glad all you guys came because you can see your name up there. We've got Dave Walls, Barb Fry, Dave Decker. Mark, you provided some good information to me, thank you. And Paul and Elise, who did I miss? Oh. Any questions? Oh, Nancy and Don, thank you.
When's the tour gonna happen?
I don't know.
The carriage tour.
Yeah. What I'm working on right now is a home for the carriage. We got to find a place to put it. I don't want it sitting in that warehouse. Nobody sees it. You know, I know. We talked about it. It seemed like a good idea at the time.
We got the groundwork all.
If you want to co-chair the committee, we'll do it together. But it's something that I know we should think about doing. He's talking about a carriage tour of through Pontiac. Any other questions? Anybody?
Yeah.
Oh.
Is the carriage gonna be restored?
That's what we were going to do. And then we had a meeting, I don't know, 20, 30 people. We ate pizza and had salad. And everybody said, I don't want to restore that. You want to preserve it. So we could restore it for $4,000. Preserving it is a whole different ballgame. I'm not even sure what you have to do to preserve it. We brought in a lady from the Henry Ford Museum, their chief preservationist. And she looked at it and she gave me a hit list of things that you could do. And I said, well, when you do your vehicles, what does it cost like just to do the top and the leather? She said, we spend anywhere from $30,000 to $80,000. That's not us.
No, there are some suppliers though in Pennsylvania, beyond the country.
Yeah.
Parts are pretty reasonable.
The thing about restoring it, I guess is the term. I looked at the vehicle that Rochester Historical Society did, and honestly, the lady was very proud of it. It's a gloss black, beautifully restored, but it looks like an Amish carriage. And the committee didn't want to do that.
Well, a lot of things are restored, they're over-restored. And you wouldn't want that.
I would like to put fabric on it. I would like to replace the leather that was on the fenders. In fact, there's a guy in town called Mad Cow. He does leather work. And he came out and looked at the carriage. He said it would take him 2 years to do the leather work. And Tom.
I'd be
Mark.
real interested I'd be real interested in what you guys would say about restoring it. Should it or shouldn't it be restored? We have some distinguished car historian experts here.
Who are you, sir?
I think it probably, I agree with you. I think it probably should not be restored and preserved.
What I thought about was to restore the raggedy top and the fenders, or replace them with new materials. And I called one of the people that Mary Fahey from the museum gave me, and you're talking big bucks. And then I thought, well, the top is going to look great, and the rest of the vehicle doesn't look so great. So is there some way that, is there somebody that knows who we can contact to get an idea of what price and timing would be? I would be glad to take information, because we have to get it out of where it is so it can be seen. But once we do that, we don't really have a place to put it. So we're looking for a place to put it also. that it can be seen and the public can use it.
There is a movement to bring the Pontiac Car Museum from Pontiac, Oakland and Pontiac, museum from Oakland, from Pontiac, Illinois, to the Crowfoot School, built in 1972, 60,000 square feet of open space. And there's a pretty good chance that's going to happen. And so that...
Thank you, Mark.
The school is available. The people in Pontiac, Illinois have outgrown their facility in Pontiac, Illinois, and they want to come here. And it should be in Pontiac, and that would be a place that you could probably put it. There's
I'm
room for...
Thank you, Mark.
There's probably room for 60 cars, 60 vehicles.
And 2 carriages? A Pontiac buggy carriage and a...
I have 2 that are going in there.
I think it would be an ideal place for it. It's a big part of Pontiac history. It's a big part of Pontiac history. It would be on display. The public would see it. And I wouldn't have to worry about it. It would be in a climate-controlled room. Now, if you notice, I had a picture from the Pontiac Museum here. I didn't just go there to take the picture. Tim is interested, but yes, ma'am.
I work with Mary. And
Oh, you do?
One of the things that I have learned in working in conservation at the Henry Fort is that just simply cleaning can make such a difference. And that there's a simple vacuum, Q-tip and spit cleaning, and just that without doing anything else can make it look.
Her list talked about getting rid of the rust, and I don't know how we would do that.
Hey, that's age patina. People pay for that stuff.
Right.
Mark agrees with you.
How would you know if it's old if it's not old?
It's only original once.
I like it the way it is. I think we lubricate the axles and do some, try to keep the wood that's there. Could we get your name before you leave, or
No, I'm incognito.
we'll find you? Tim, could you get a video of her? Make sure. Not just the back of her head, Tim. Any other questions? I know you guys have a meeting and we're way over time. I'm sorry. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, one
yes,
last
ma'am.
question.
Yeah,
When is your facility open for the public to view?
good question. We got some stuff out in the back of the room. We have a couple members here, Barbara Fry and Dave Decker, are willing to talk to you about what we do. We do monthly events. We're open 3 days a week from 11 to 4, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Stop by, come talk with us, meet our researchers, have a cup of coffee. It's not always that good, but it's the social. So you guys are getting ready for your meeting. Who am I turning the floor over to? Hey, thank you, everybody.